January 24th, 1941. London, England. The steady hum of the air raid sirens outside was the last sound Susan Rees expected to hear while sitting in her cramped, dimly lit office in the heart of London. The walls, worn and stained by years of war, seemed to close in on her with each passing hour. She sat at a battered wooden desk, one of countless others in the vast and sterile room. A stack of files teetered in front of her, confidential documents, some of which had already been shredded, others sealed with the weight of secrecy. She had spent the better part of the afternoon organizing reports on ammunition supplies, troop movements, and intercepted enemy transmissions. It was the daily grind of the war effort. But this was different. The envelope lay in front of her, stark white against the dark wood of the desk. No stamp, no return address. The seal was simple, unassuming, yet there was something about it that made her hands tremble. She knew the protocol. She knew what it meant. But she also knew she had never seen a document like this one before. Susan had joined the War Office in 1939, just after the war broke out, eager to contribute in whatever way she could. At the time, she had been young, idealistic, and naive. Her job was to type, file, and relay messages. Little did she know that her work would soon cross paths with something far darker and far more consequential than she had ever imagined. The war had already changed everything. Friends she had once shared tea with had either gone to the front lines or disappeared into other departments, their faces now distant and hard to recall. Susan had been given a modest promotion to work in a top-secret unit. It wasn't glamorous, but it was important. The letters, the memos, the documents, they all mattered. Each one was a small piece of the puzzle that might help in the war. Or, as the case was often with her work, they were carefully guarded secrets that no one else should ever know. But this letter was different. The very air in the room seemed to thicken as she stared at it. She reached out and slowly broke the seal, her fingers unsteady. The paper inside was old, the ink slightly smudged, but the words were clear. Immediate action required. Destroy these letters without exception. Susan's heart raced as she read on. The letter was explicit in its instructions. A list of other letters and reports followed, all of them marked for immediate destruction. The names mentioned in the documents were of high-ranking diplomats from both Britain and neutral countries, their correspondence relating to secret alliances and covert agreements that had been made behind closed doors. These were not just ordinary reports. These were the threads of diplomacy that held the fragile peace of Europe together, and they were about to be erased from history. The order was simple: burn everything. Destroy the evidence. No questions asked, but Susan knew the stakes. She had heard whispers in the halls, rumors about the fragile peace between Britain and the countries deemed neutral by the wartime government. If these letters were ever made public, it would reveal secrets that could undermine everything the government had worked so hard to maintain. The very nature of the alliances would be questioned, and the public's trust in their leaders could be shattered. People would ask why Britain had chosen to keep these negotiations secret, and more troubling still, why had they been forced to burn the evidence? Yet, as the sound of the bombers grew louder and closer, Susan couldn't bring herself to destroy the letters. The thought gnawed at her. There was something visceral about the truth, something that could not be erased, not so easily, not without consequences. If these letters held the answers to the most critical questions of the war, could she really be the one to let them disappear forever? She glanced around her office, at the rows of desks, at the indifferent faces of her colleagues who were immersed in their own tasks. None of them had noticed the letter in her hands. None of them would ever know what she was about to do. With a deep breath, Susan carefully placed the letter back into the envelope. She didn't know what it meant to keep them, to hide them. She didn't know if this was an act of defiance or simply a mistake she would regret later. But in that moment, with the bombs falling closer, her hands moved instinctively to the drawer of her desk. The drawer was small, wedged between the base of the desk and a thick file of completed reports. It wasn't an ideal hiding place, but it would do. She shoved the envelope into the back corner, the letters safely tucked away beneath a layer of old papers. If anyone came looking for them, she would deny ever having seen the letter. She would deny ever having received such an order. And for now, that would be enough. The world outside continued to burn, as did her mind. She sat there for a long time, staring at the drawer as though it held the weight of the entire world. For a fleeting moment, she imagined what would happen if she chose to burn the letters. The sense of relief would be immediate. She could go on, pretending nothing had changed. But then she thought of the people who would never know the full story. The soldiers, the civilians, the families who had already lost so much. They deserved to know the truth, didn't they? Susan's thoughts swirled in a violent storm of fear, confusion, and responsibility. She wasn't a historian. She wasn't a politician. She was just a secretary, a young woman who had found herself caught in the middle of something much larger than herself. She didn't know if the world was ready for the truth contained in those letters, nor did she know if she could bear the consequences of revealing them. But one thing was clear: she would never forget the moment she made that choice. That act of defiance, however small, had the power to change everything. If anyone ever found those letters, if they were ever revealed to the world, it would mark the beginning of a new kind of history. And in that moment, Susan realized that she wasn't just a passive observer in this war. She was now part of its story. Whether or not the world would ever know, it was another matter entirely. The air raid sirens howled again, the world outside crashing down in a fury of sound and light. But inside that small office, tucked away in the shadows, Susan Rees had made her choice. And history would never be the same. March 10th, 1942. London, England. The days blurred together. London, battered and scarred by the ceaseless air raids, had become a city of shadows. The streets were empty, save for the occasional hurried footsteps of those who still dared to venture out for food or supplies. People had learned to move with caution, as if the very air around them could crack open and send them fleeing for shelter. Susan had learned, too, how to keep her head down, how to become invisible in a world that seemed to be crumbling by the minute. Her office, though still functional, felt like an afterthought now. The faint hum of typewriters, the distant echoes of colleagues speaking in hushed tones, it all seemed so distant, so irrelevant. The war had shifted in its course, its focus now firmly on survival, not strategy. Yet, as Susan sat at her desk each day, the quiet rebellion she had started, no, the quiet defiance she had buried, gnawed at her from within. She could not forget what she had hidden, nor could she forget the weight of the decision that had put it there. The drawer beneath her desk was now a sanctuary. It wasn't a grand hiding place, not by any means. The space was cramped, the documents within it buried beneath piles of reports and files that anyone else might have mistaken for the remnants of a disorganized desk. But she knew what was there. She knew what it contained. Every time her fingers brushed against the drawer, a chill ran down her spine. She could feel the truth pressing against her, like an invisible weight. Susan hadn't told anyone about the letters. Not a soul. It was a secret so deeply woven into her life that it had become part of her, like a thread running through the fabric of her existence. She couldn't share it, not even with her closest friend, a fellow secretary named Margaret. Margaret had always been an open book, bright, curious, unafraid of asking questions, even when others told her to mind her business. But Susan couldn't bring herself to tell her. The fear of what would happen if someone knew was too great. It wasn't just the threat of losing her job. It was the fear of becoming something she wasn't sure she could live with. The letters, she knew, had to stay hidden. If they were discovered, if anyone ever found out what she had done, it would be the end of her. She would be nothing more than a footnote in a history that was written by others, by those who understood power, who controlled information, who shaped the narrative to fit their needs. The war wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about preserving the delicate illusion that everything was under control. But each passing day felt like a slow burn, a constant reminder of what she had chosen. The letters, those fragile pieces of paper containing the secrets of governments and diplomats, waited in that drawer, as if daring her to confront them again. They had a life of their own now, she realized. A life that was somehow intertwined with hers, even if she couldn't explain why. It was as if the weight of the letters had passed into her own soul, becoming part of her inner turmoil. The office was quieter now. Fewer people came in, and the piles of paperwork seemed to grow ever larger. The war had drained the vitality from the people around her, had sapped them of their energy and hope. Even Margaret had changed. She no longer spoke about the future with the same enthusiasm she once had. Now, she often stared out the window, as if waiting for something to happen, as if she expected the war to swallow them all whole. And yet, even Margaret, so often the one to question, had never once asked Susan what she was hiding. She never noticed the extra care Susan took in locking the drawer, the way her eyes darted nervously whenever she passed too close to it. Time moved in a strange, almost surreal way in those days. The moments stretched into endless hours, the minutes melding together into an indistinguishable blur. Susan would sometimes find herself staring at the hands of the clock, willing them to move faster, to make the day end. But no matter how much she wished for time to pass, it remained the same, slow, relentless, unforgiving. One evening, as the office began to empty out, Susan found herself alone, still staring at the drawer. She reached for the envelope again, her fingers trembling as she carefully pulled it out. For a moment, she simply held it in her hands, the weight of it almost unbearable. She could almost hear the letters calling to her, like a distant echo, urging her to confront them once and for all. She had read the letters before, of course. She knew their contents by heart now. There was no doubt in her mind that the contents of those letters, those carefully hidden secrets, could change the entire course of the war. But what if they didn't? What if revealing them only caused more chaos, more suffering? She had seen how fragile the public's trust was, how easily the enemy could exploit even the smallest crack in the facade. Was she really prepared to risk it all? The questions spiraled in her mind, each one adding another layer of doubt, another reason to keep the letters hidden. Yet, there was a part of her deep inside that refused to let them go. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was holding something more than just a piece of paper. She was holding a truth that the world might never be ready to hear. And in that truth, she saw a reflection of herself, a woman caught between duty and morality, between the needs of the many and the rights of the few. As the night drew on, Susan placed the letter back into the drawer, locking it once more. The decision felt heavier than ever, but she knew there was no turning back now. The letters were part of her life, part of the story she was unwilling to tell. She couldn't let them out, not yet. Not until she understood what they meant. Not until she understood what they might cost her. When she left the office that night, the streets of London were quiet, eerily so. The sirens had stopped, and the sound of distant bombs was barely audible. But in the stillness, Susan couldn't shake the feeling that the world around her had changed forever. And no matter how much she tried to bury it, the secret in that drawer was a part of that change. She could feel it like a weight pressing on her chest. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She didn't know if the letters would ever see the light of day. But as she walked home through the darkened streets, she knew one thing for certain. The quiet defiance she had chosen would be with her for the rest of her life. And whatever happened next, it would be a part of the history no one could ever erase. September 12th, 1963. Oxford, England. The attic was dark and musty, the faint smell of mildew creeping into every corner. Dust particles floated in the slanted light from the single window above, as though the very air in this forgotten space was suspended in time. Among the forgotten trunks and old family heirlooms, there were stories, relics of lives lived and lives lost, each piece a fragment of a past that was slipping away with every passing year. The historian, an unassuming man in his early 40s, moved carefully through the clutter, his hand grazing over the cardboard boxes that stacked high against the walls. He had come here to find something important, something long buried. But what exactly, he wasn't sure. It had been a random lead, something he'd stumbled upon during his research into wartime Britain. An estate sale, a list of items with questionable provenance. Among the books, the old diaries, and the mundane artifacts of ordinary life, there had been mention of a small collection of letters. letters from the early years of the war. They had said nothing of major consequence. Yet something about the description had sparked his curiosity. He had followed the thread, tracing it from one obscure archive to another, until it had led him here, to this crumbling house on the outskirts of Oxford. The boxes he was digging through were part of an old family estate, the kind that had fallen into disrepair over the decades. The family who once lived here had disappeared, some gone to war, others left behind, their names now fading from the memory of the community. This particular family had been involved in the diplomatic circles during the war, but like so many others, they had been swept away by the tides of history. There was no one left to ask about the contents of these boxes. The only trace of their past was the evidence left behind, forgotten in the creaking attic of an old house. It was in the bottom of one of those boxes that he found it. At first, it seemed like just another bundle of old correspondence, yellowing paper, frayed edges, and ink that had faded with time. But as he carefully opened the envelope, he realized that these were no ordinary letters. The handwriting was distinct, deliberate, familiar, somehow. As he read the first few lines, his pulse quickened. The letters were more than just diplomatic chatter. They were intimate, revealing details of backdoor negotiations, covert strategies, and personal exchanges between some of the most powerful players of the time. These are the very letters Susan Rees had hidden all those years ago. The historian's breath caught in his throat. He had heard whispers of documents like these, whispers that had been lost to time, buried by those who wished to keep them secret. But to find them here, in a forgotten attic, was something else entirely. It was a discovery that could change everything. He continued reading, the names of diplomats, military officers, and even members of the royal family jumping out at him from the pages. The information was explosive, a treasure trove of secrets that had been kept hidden for decades. But as he read on, he realized something even more extraordinary. The letters themselves weren't just a revelation of wartime politics. They told the story of Susan Rees, of her quiet, almost invisible role in history. The historian knew that he was holding something far more significant than just the correspondence of diplomats and generals. These letters were the legacy of a woman who had been forgotten by history, a woman who had taken matters into her own hands when no one else dared to. The letters spoke of a quiet secretary who had defied orders, who had chosen to protect history instead of erasing it. They spoke of her courage in the face of overwhelming pressure, her decision to hide the truth rather than destroy it. And as he read further, the historian realized that this was not just the story of a woman's quiet rebellion. It was the story of a pivotal moment in history, a moment that had slipped through the cracks, unnoticed by all but a few. The historian's mind raced as he processed the enormity of what he had found. These letters were not just a footnote in history. They were the key to understanding a crucial part of the war that had been deliberately buried. Susan Rees had known the stakes. She had known the risks she was taking. And yet, despite the consequences, she had made the decision to protect the truth. But why? Why had she kept these letters hidden for so long, even after the war had ended? And why had no one ever heard her story? As the historian continued to sift through the documents, he began to piece together the broader context of Susan's actions.